The sound of gunfire echoed through the dusty streets of Nogales, Arizona, and Teresa Rodriguez pressed herself against the rough adobe wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. It was the spring of 1883, and she had arrived in this border town only 3 days ago, fleeing a past that had left her hollow and broken. The widow's weeds she wore were still crisp and black, though dust from the desert had already begun to coat the hem of her skirt. At 24 years old, she had buried a husband who never loved her and escaped a life that had nearly killed her spirit. Now, watching 2 drunken cowboys shoot bottles off a fence post in broad daylight, she wondered if coming west had been the biggest mistake of her life. Teresa had left St. Louis with little more than the clothes on her back and the small inheritance her grandmother had left her, money her late husband Robert had never known about. The marriage had been arranged by her father, a business transaction that left her trapped with a man whose cruelty was matched only by his indifference. When pneumonia took him last winter, she felt nothing but relief, and that absence of grief had terrified her more than anything. She had forgotten how to feel, how to hope, how to imagine a future that held anything beyond gray days and emptiness. The gunfire stopped, and Teresa took a shaky breath, smoothing her skirts as she continued down the dusty street toward the general store. Nogales sat right on the border with Mexico, a town where 2 worlds collided in a chaos of languages, cultures, and opportunities. The air smelled of creosote, mesquite smoke, and something cooking that made her stomach growl despite her anxiety. She had rented a small room above the millinery shop, and the woman who owned it, Mrs. Chen, had been kind enough not to ask too many questions about a young widow traveling alone. The general store was dim and cool inside, a relief from the relentless Arizona sun. Teresa was examining a bolt of blue calico when she heard a deep voice behind her. "That color would suit you better than all that black." She turned sharply, ready to deliver a cutting response to whatever presumptuous man thought he could comment on her clothing choices. But the words died in her throat when she met his eyes. They were the color of warm honey, set in a face that was all hard plains and sun-bronzed skin. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. He held his hat in his hands, and there was something almost apologetic in his expression. "I did not mean any offense, madam," he said quickly, his voice carrying the slow drawl of someone who had grown up under these wide western skies. "I just thought. Well, you look like you could use a bit of color in your life." Teresa felt heat rise to her cheeks, though whether from anger or something else, she could not quite say. "My choice of clothing is hardly your concern, sir." "No, madam, it is not." He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable but not backing away. "I am Thomas Vaughn. My ranch is about 10 miles north of town. I was hoping to speak with you, actually, if you are Miss Rodriguez." Her surprise must have shown on her face because he continued quickly. "Mrs. Chen mentioned you were looking for work, and I am in need of help at the ranch. My housekeeper quit last month, ran off to California with a prospector, and the place is falling apart without her. I can offer fair wages, room and board, and respectable work. I know it is not proper for me to approach you like this, but I am getting desperate." Teresa's mind raced. She had been looking for work, it was true. Her small inheritance would not last forever, and she had no intention of being dependent on anyone ever again. But going to work at a bachelor's ranch, the impropriety of it made her want to refuse immediately. As if reading her thoughts, Thomas Vaughn added, "I have 3 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse, and all of them are married men whose wives live in town. They come to work during the day. You would have the main house to yourself at night with a lock on your door, and I give you my word as a gentleman that you would be safe and respected." "I do not know you well enough to judge the worth of your word," Teresa said, but even as she spoke, she felt something stir inside her. Not attraction, surely. She had sworn off men and marriage and all the pain that came with them, but there was something in his eyes, a sincerity that she had rarely seen in any man. "That is fair," he acknowledged. "Come out to the ranch tomorrow. Look around, meet the men who work there, see the place in daylight. If you do not like what you see, I will drive you back to town myself, and we will speak no more of it. But if you think you could be comfortable there, the job is yours." Against every bit of common sense she possessed, Teresa found herself nodding. "I will come tomorrow morning, but I make no promises beyond that. That is all I ask, madam." Thomas Vaughn's face broke into a smile that transformed his severe features into something almost boyish. "I will pick you up at the millinery shop at 8 o'clock, if that suits you." 8 o'clock, Teresa agreed, and watched as he placed his hat back on his head, tipped it to her politely, and walked out of the store with long, easy strides. That night, Teresa lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the town settling down for the night. Somewhere a guitar played, the notes floating up through her open window along with the cooler desert air. She thought about Thomas Vaughn's honey-colored eyes and the way he had spoken to her, direct but respectful. She thought about his comment about color in her life, and how he had somehow seen through her widow's weeds to the emptiness beneath. No, she told herself firmly. She was not ready for any of that. She would take the job if the ranch proved acceptable, but only for the work and the wages. Her heart was locked away, and she intended to keep it that way. She had been hurt too badly to risk it again. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the sky that brilliant blue that seemed unique to the desert. Teresa dressed in her black dress, because it was all she had, and tied her dark hair back in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. She was waiting in front of the millinery shop when Thomas Vaughn arrived in a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 bay horses. "Good morning, Miss Rodriguez," he called out, jumping down to help her up to the seat. His hand was warm and calloused when she took it, the hand of a man who did hard physical work. "It is a fine day for a drive." The ranch was indeed about 10 miles north of town, and the ride took them through landscape that was harsh and beautiful in equal measure. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels, their arms raised to the sky. Mountains ringed the horizon, purple and blue in the distance. Thomas pointed out landmarks as they drove, talking easily about the land and the ranch. "I bought the place 5 years ago," he told her. "It had been abandoned for a while, and I got it cheap. Spent the first 2 years just making it livable again. Now I run about 200 head of cattle, some horses. It is not the biggest spread in Arizona, but it is mine, and I am proud of it." "You have no family?" Teresa asked, then immediately regretted the personal question, but Thomas did not seem to mind. "My parents died of fever when I was 16, he said, his voice matter of fact but with an undercurrent of old pain. "I had been working on ranches since I was 12, so I just kept doing what I knew, saved every penny I could, and when I heard about this place, I took a chance." He glanced at her. "What brought you to Nogales, if you do not mind me asking?" Teresa hesitated, then decided on a version of the truth. "I am a widow. My husband died last winter. There was nothing left for me in St. Louis, so I decided to start over somewhere new." "I am sorry for your loss," Thomas said quietly, and something in his tone made her look at him sharply. But his expression was simply kind, without the false sympathy she had endured from so many others. "I am not," Teresa said, surprising herself with her honesty. "It was not a happy marriage. I should not speak ill of the dead, but I will not pretend to mourn what I do not miss." Thomas was quiet for a moment, and Teresa braced herself for judgment or platitudes. Instead, he simply nodded. My older brother married a woman he did not love because their families expected it. I watched them make each other miserable for 3 years before he finally got up the courage to end it. Sometimes the wrong match is worse than no match at all. Much worse. Teresa agreed softly and felt something inside her chest loosen slightly, some tight knot of shame and guilt that she had been carrying. The ranch came into view as they crested a low rise. It was not fancy, but it was solid and well maintained. The main house was built of adobe, with a wooden porch running along the front. There was a barn, a corral with several horses, and a smaller building that must be the bunkhouse. Trees had been planted near the house, cottonwoods that provided shade, and there was even a small vegetable garden, though it looked sadly neglected. The housekeeper used to tend that garden, Thomas said, following her gaze. I am afraid I do not have much talent for growing things. I am better with animals. He helped her down from the wagon, and Teresa looked around with a critical eye. The yard was tidy, the buildings in good repair. 3 men were working near the barn, and they looked up with curious expressions as Thomas led her toward the house. Let me show you inside, he said, opening the door and stepping back to let her enter first. The interior was dim and cool with thick adobe walls that kept out the heat. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a good stove, and down a short hallway 3 bedrooms. The furniture was simple but sturdy, and everything was covered in a fine layer of dust. I have been doing my own cooking and cleaning, Thomas admitted, looking embarrassed. But as you can see, I am not very good at the cleaning part. The housekeeper's room is this one here. He opened a door to reveal a small bedroom with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the vegetable garden. It is not much, but it is private, and like I said, you would have a lock on the door. Teresa walked into the room and looked around. It was plain, but it was clean and bright, and when she looked out the window, she could see all the way to the mountains. Something about the view made her throat tighten. In St. Louis, she had looked out on narrow streets and brick buildings. Here, the world was wide open, full of space and possibility. What would my duties be? She asked, turning back to face Thomas, who stood in the doorway, careful not to enter the room himself. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending, he said. Basic household work. I eat simple food, nothing fancy required. The ranch hands bring their lunch with them from town, so you would only be cooking for me mostly. And for yourself, of course. I would pay you $35 a month plus room and board. It was a generous wage, more than Teresa had expected. She looked at Thomas Vaughn's earnest face and tried to read what lay behind those honey-colored eyes. Was he truly just a desperate rancher in need of help? Or was there some other motive? As if sensing her doubt, Thomas said quietly, I know what it is like to need a fresh start, Miss Rodriguez. I know what it is like to want to leave the past behind and build something new. I am offering you honest work and a safe place to do it. Nothing more, nothing less. But if you would rather look for something else in town, I understand. Teresa made her decision in that moment, based not on logic but on instinct. Something told her she could trust this man, at least enough to try. I will take the position, Mr. Vaughn. When would you like me to start? The relief on his face was so obvious that Teresa felt herself relax slightly. Whatever his motives, they seemed genuinely honorable. Would tomorrow be too soon? He asked. I can come into town and collect you and your things in the morning. Tomorrow would be fine, Teresa agreed, and felt a small flutter of something that might have been hope, or might just have been nervousness. Either way, it was better than the numbness that had consumed her for so long. They drove back to town, and Thomas helped her down from the wagon in front of the millinery shop. "Thank you for giving me a chance, Miss Rodriguez," he said, his voice warm. "I think you will like it at the ranch once you settle in." "I hope you are right, Mr. Vaughn," Teresa replied, and watched as he drove away, the wagon rattling over the rutted street. Mrs. Chen was standing in the doorway when Teresa turned around, her dark eyes bright with curiosity. "So, you are going to work for him?" "Yes," Teresa said. "He seems like an honorable man." "He is," Mrs. Chen confirmed, nodding vigorously. "Thomas Vaughn is known as a fair employer and a man of his word. You will be safe there, I think, and maybe—" She paused, her expression turning sly. "Maybe nothing," Teresa said firmly. "It is just a job, Mrs. Chen. That is all." "Of course," Mrs. Chen said, but her smile suggested she was not convinced. The next morning, Teresa packed her few belongings into a small trunk. She did not own much, had traveled light from St. Louis, bringing only what she could carry. Her grandmother's wedding ring, which she wore on a chain around her neck. A few photographs. Some books. Her clothes, all of them black or gray or brown, colors of mourning and forgetting. Thomas arrived promptly at 8, and after saying goodbye to Mrs. Chen and thanking her for her kindness, Teresa climbed up into the wagon once more. The ride to the ranch felt different this time, less like a visit and more like a journey towards something new. Teresa watched the desert landscape roll by and tried not to think too hard about what she was doing. If it did not work out, she could always return to town and find something else. When they reached the ranch, Thomas helped her carry her trunk into the house and set it in her new room. "I will let you get settled," he said. "There is no rush to start today. Take your time, look around, make yourself at home." But Teresa was not the type to sit idle. As soon as Thomas went back outside to work with his men, she tied an apron over her black dress and set about cleaning the house. The work was familiar and oddly soothing. She swept and dusted, washed windows, scrubbed the kitchen until it gleamed. She found linens in a cupboard and made up her own bed, then did the same for Thomas's room, trying not to feel too intrusive as she handled his belongings. By the time the sun was high in the sky, the house looked 100 times better, and Teresa was hot and dusty, but also more satisfied than she had felt in months. She pumped water from the kitchen pump and drank deeply, then looked around for something to make for lunch. The pantry was reasonably well stocked with basic supplies, and she found eggs and bacon and some slightly stale bread. She cooked up a simple meal and was just plating it when Thomas came in, looking surprised. "I told you there was no rush," he said, but his eyes took in the clean kitchen with obvious appreciation. "I do not like being idle," Teresa said. "And you need to eat." "So do I. Sit down." Thomas sat and they ate in companionable silence. The food was simple but good, and Teresa noticed that Thomas ate with the focused attention of a man who had been surviving on his own poor cooking for too long. "This is delicious," he said finally. "I had forgotten what it was like to eat food that actually tasted good." "It is just eggs and bacon," Teresa said, but she felt a small glow of pleasure at the compliment. After lunch, Thomas went back to work, and Teresa continued her cleaning campaign. She tackled the main room, beating the dust out of the rugs and washing the windows until they sparkled. She found herself humming as she worked, an old song her grandmother used to sing, and realized with a start that she felt almost content. The days settled into a routine. Teresa rose early, made breakfast, cleaned the house, tended the neglected vegetable garden, prepared meals. Thomas worked from dawn to dusk with his 3 ranch hands, coming in for meals and occasionally in the evening to do paperwork at the desk in the main room. They spoke little at first, both circling around each other with careful politeness. But gradually, as days turned into weeks, they began to talk more. Teresa learned that Thomas was 27, that he had taught himself to read from old newspapers and dime novels, that his dream was to build his ranch into something substantial that he could pass down to future generations. Thomas learned that Teresa loved books, that she missed the theaters and concerts of St. Louis, but not the stuffiness of society life, that she had always wanted to see the ocean but never had. One morning, about 3 weeks after Teresa had started working at the ranch, Thomas came into the kitchen looking thoughtful. "Miss Rodriguez, I have been thinking," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot she always kept warm. "You have been here almost a month now, and you have barely left the house and garden. This is beautiful country, but you will never see it if you stay inside all day." "I have work to do," Teresa said, kneading dough for bread, "and I am perfectly content here." "Even so," Thomas said, "I think you should learn to ride. If you are going to live on a ranch, you should be able to get around on your own. What if there was an emergency and you needed to get to town?" Teresa's hands stilled in the dough. "I have never ridden a horse in my life, Mr. Vaughn. I would probably fall off and break my neck." "Not if I teach you properly," Thomas said. "And please call me Thomas. We live in the same house, even if properly separated. Mr. Vaughn makes me feel like an old man." "Then you should call me Teresa," she replied, though the informality felt strange on her tongue. She had been Miss Rodriguez or Mrs. Harrison for so long, she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be just Teresa. "Teresa," Thomas repeated, and the way he said her name, with that slow Western drawl, made something flutter in her chest. She ignored it firmly. "I am not sure about learning to ride," she said, returning her attention to the bread dough. "Think about it," Thomas said. "The offer stands whenever you are ready." Teresa did think about it over the next several days. She thought about it while she hung laundry on the line, while she weeded the garden, while she prepared meals. The truth was, she did feel confined sometimes, trapped by her own limitations. The desert called to her, the wide open spaces, the mountains in the distance. She wanted to see more of it, to explore, to feel truly free in a way she never had before. Finally, one morning at breakfast, she said abruptly, "I want to learn. To ride, I mean, if your offer is still open." Thomas's face lit up with a smile that made him look years younger. "Of course it is still open. We can start this afternoon if you like. I have a mare that would be perfect for you. Her name is Mariposa, and she is as gentle as they come." That afternoon, Teresa changed out of her work dress and into the split riding skirt she had bought in town on Thomas's recommendation. She had never worn such a garment before, had always ridden side saddle on the rare occasions she rode at all in St. Louis. But Thomas had explained that side saddle riding was not practical for ranch work, and if she was going to learn, she should learn to ride properly. The skirt felt strange, almost scandalous in its practicality, but Teresa had to admit it was more comfortable than trying to manage a regular dress on horseback. She walked out to the corral where Thomas was waiting with a pretty chestnut mare with a white star on her forehead. "This is Mariposa," Thomas said, stroking the mare's neck. "Mariposa, meet Teresa. You two are going to be good friends." Teresa approached cautiously, and the mare turned her large brown eyes toward her with what seemed like patient curiosity. Teresa reached out slowly and touched the soft muzzle, feeling the warmth of the mare's breath on her hand. "She is beautiful," Teresa said softly. "She is," Thomas agreed. "And she has the sweetest temperament of any horse I have ever known. She will take good care of you while you learn." He spent the next hour teaching Teresa the basics, showing her how to approach the horse, how to hold the reins, how to mount. Teresa was terrified the first time she pulled herself up into the saddle, the ground suddenly seeming very far away. But Mariposa stood perfectly still, and Thomas's hand was steady on her ankle, steadying her. "You are doing great," he said, his voice calm and encouraging. "Just relax. The horse can feel if you are tense. Take a deep breath. Teresa did and felt some of the tension leave her body. From up on Mariposa's back, she could see over the corral fence to the desert beyond, and suddenly she understood the appeal of riding. Up here, she felt powerful, capable, free. "Now," Thomas said, "I am going to lead her around the corral slowly. Just focus on finding your balance, moving with the horse. Do not fight the motion." He led Mariposa in slow circles around the corral, and Teresa gripped the saddle horn with white knuckles at first, certain she was going to fall. But gradually, she began to relax into the horse's gentle gait, feeling the rhythm of it, the way Mariposa's movements became her own movements. It was like dancing, she realized with surprise, like the waltzes she had been forced to learn as a girl, that sense of moving in harmony with another being. "You are a natural," Thomas called up to her, and Teresa felt a rush of pride that was entirely new. In her old life, she had never been good at anything physical, had been told by her husband that she was clumsy and graceless. But here, on this horse in this new place, she felt strong and capable. They continued the lessons every afternoon after Teresa's morning work was done. Thomas was a patient teacher, never pushing her beyond what she was ready for, always encouraging. Within a week, Teresa was riding Mariposa around the corral on her own, and the following week, Thomas suggested they take a short ride out onto the ranch land. "Nothing too ambitious," he said. "Just out to the west pasture and back. But I think you are ready, and I think you will enjoy it." Teresa was nervous but excited as she mounted Mariposa. Thomas rode beside her on his own horse, a big gray gelding named Storm, and they set out at a walk across the scrubby desert. The sun was warm on Teresa's face, but there was a breeze that kept the heat from being oppressive. All around them, the landscape stretched away in shades of gold and green and russet, alive with a stark beauty that took her breath away. "It is so different from anything I have ever known," Teresa said, looking around with wonder. "So much space, so much sky." "That is what I love about it," Thomas said. "Back east, everything felt crowded, closed in. Out here, you can breathe. You can see for miles. It makes you realize how big the world is and how small your problems are in comparison." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, and Teresa found herself watching Thomas out of the corner of her eye. He sat his horse with easy grace, completely at home in the saddle, part of the landscape himself. His hat shaded his face, but she could see the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands were gentle but firm on the reins. He was handsome, she acknowledged to herself. More than handsome. And kind, which was rarer and more valuable. Over the past 6 weeks of living at the ranch, she had seen how he treated his workers with respect, how he cared for his animals with gentle attention, how he never expected more from her than fair work for fair wages. He had kept his word about her safety and privacy, had never once made her feel uncomfortable or threatened. And yet, Teresa reminded herself firmly, she was not looking for romance. She had been damaged too badly by her marriage, had learned too well that trusting a man with your heart only led to pain. Thomas might be different, but she could not afford to take that risk. Better to keep things professional, friendly but distant. "You are doing wonderfully," Thomas said, breaking into her thoughts. "I think in another week or two you will be ready for a longer ride. Maybe we could pack a lunch and ride out to the canyon. There is a spot there that I think you would like." "I would like that," Teresa said, and meant it. Not because of the man beside her, she told herself, but because of the freedom the horse represented, the chance to explore this new world she had found herself in. They continued the riding lessons, and Teresa's skill and confidence grew with each passing day. She found herself looking forward to the afternoons, to the feeling of the wind in her face and the powerful muscles of the horse beneath her. She took over the care of Mariposa, grooming her each morning and evening, bringing her apples from the neglected orchard behind the house that was slowly coming back to life under Teresa's attention. One evening, about 2 months after Teresa had come to the ranch, she was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Thomas came in looking troubled. "Is something wrong?" Teresa asked, looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. Thomas pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had learned meant he was worried about something. "One of my hands, Miguel. His wife is sick. They think it might be influenza. He needs to stay in town to care for her and the children, which means I am short a man during roundup season." "Can you manage with just 2?" Teresa asked. "It will be hard," Thomas admitted, "but I do not have much choice. I cannot ask Miguel to leave his family at a time like this, and good ranch hands are not easy to find, especially this time of year when everyone is busy with their own roundup." Teresa turned back to her vegetables, an idea forming in her mind. It was crazy, probably impossible, but she found herself saying, "I could help." Thomas looked at her in surprise. "You, Teresa, roundup is hard, dirty work. It is dawn to dusk in the saddle, roping cattle, riding hard. It is not women's work." Teresa finished for him, feeling a flash of irritation. "I can ride now. Maybe not as well as your experienced hands, but I can stay in the saddle. I can help with the sorting at least. Free up your men for the heavier work." Thomas studied her, and Teresa lifted her chin, meeting his gaze steadily. She had no idea where this sudden boldness had come from, but she found she liked it. The old Teresa would never have suggested such a thing. But the new Teresa, the one who lived in the desert and rode horses and had calluses on her hands from honest work, wanted to try. "You might be right," Thomas said slowly. "You would not be able to do the roping, but you could help with the sorting and counting. It would be a big help, actually, if you are serious about it." "I am serious," Teresa said firmly. "Then we start the day after tomorrow at dawn," Thomas said. "Get some rest tomorrow. You are going to need it." Roundup was even harder than Teresa had imagined. They started before sunrise, eating a quick breakfast before mounting up and riding out to where the cattle were spread across the range. Thomas and his 2 remaining hands, Jose and William, did the dangerous work of roping the half-wild cattle and bringing them in, while Teresa helped with sorting the cows from calves, keeping count, making sure none escaped back out to the range. The work was hot, dusty, and exhausting. By the end of the first day, every muscle in Teresa's body ached, and she had blisters on her hands from the rains despite her gloves. But she also felt more alive than she had in years. There was something intoxicating about the work, the challenge of it, the satisfaction of accomplishing something real and tangible. Thomas watched her with something like amazement in his eyes. "You are tougher than you look," he said that first evening as they ate a late dinner, both of them too tired to talk much. "I am discovering that about myself," Teresa replied, and it was true. She was discovering all sorts of things about herself that she had never known. She was strong. She was brave. She was capable of more than she had ever imagined. The roundup took a week, and by the end of it, Teresa felt like a different person. Her face was sunburned despite the wide-brimmed hat Thomas had insisted she wear. Her body was lean and hard from the physical work. And something inside her had shifted. Some locked door had opened just a crack, letting in light. On the last evening of the roundup, after the cattle had been counted and marked and the men had headed back to town, Thomas and Teresa sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun set over the desert. The sky was on fire with color, oranges and pinks and purples bleeding into each other in a display that made Teresa's throat tighten with its beauty. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly. We could not have done it without you, not as quickly or as smoothly." "I enjoyed it," Teresa said, surprising herself with the admission. "It was hard, but I felt useful, important. I felt like I was part of something." Thomas turned to look at her, and in the fading light his eyes were dark and unreadable. "You are important, Teresa. You have been important to this ranch, to me, from the day you arrived. This place was just a house before you came. Now it is a home." Teresa's heart began to beat faster, and she felt a flutter of something that might have been fear or might have been hope. "Thomas, You do not have to say anything," Thomas interrupted gently. "I just wanted you to know. I am grateful for everything you have done, for who you are. That is all." But it was not all, and they both knew it. Something had shifted between them during those long days of working side by side, something neither of them was quite ready to name. Teresa felt it in the air between them, electric and fragile, and she did not know whether to lean into it or pull away. In the end, she did neither. She simply sat beside Thomas as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and let herself feel, really feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember. The weeks that followed the roundup were some of the happiest Teresa had known. Fall was coming to the desert, the brutal heat of summer giving way to cooler temperatures and clear, bright days. Miguel returned to work, his wife recovered, and the family crisis passed. Teresa went back to her regular household duties, but Thomas continued to take her riding several times a week, showing her more of the ranch and the surrounding country. One afternoon in late September, they rode out to the canyon Thomas had mentioned weeks earlier. It took them 2 hours to get there, riding through landscape that grew progressively more dramatic. The flat desert gave way to rocky hills, and then suddenly they were at the edge of a canyon that took Teresa's breath away. It was not as large as the Grand Canyon she had heard about, but it was spectacular in its own right, carved deep into the red rock by centuries of water and wind. They dismounted and walked to the edge, and Teresa looked down at the ribbon of water far below, glinting in the afternoon sun. "This is incredible," she breathed. "I have never seen anything like it." "I come here sometimes when I need to think," Thomas said, "or when I need to remember why I love this land so much. It reminds me that there are things bigger and older than me, than my problems, than anything I might worry about." They sat on a flat rock near the edge, eating the lunch Teresa had packed, and talked about everything and nothing. Thomas told her stories about learning to ranch, about the mistakes he had made and the lessons he had learned. Teresa found herself talking about her childhood, about her grandmother who had been the only person who truly loved her, about her dreams of a different kind of life. "I wanted to be a teacher," she admitted. "I loved books, loved learning, but my father said it was not appropriate for a woman of my station. He arranged my marriage instead, and I was too young and too obedient to fight him." "It is not too late," Thomas said. "You could still teach. There is a school in Nogales that is always looking for teachers, or you could start your own school here at the ranch. There are plenty of ranch families around here who would love to have someone educated teaching their children." Teresa looked at him in surprise. "You would not mind?" "If I did something like that, why would I mind?" Thomas looked genuinely confused. "Teresa, you are not my property. You work for me, yes, but that does not mean I control your whole life. If teaching would make you happy, then you should teach." It was such a simple statement, but it rocked Teresa to her core. In her marriage, her husband had controlled every aspect of her life, from what she wore to where she went to whom she spoke to. The idea that Thomas saw her as an independent person with her own dreams and ambitions was almost too much to process. "You are different from any man I have ever known," she said softly. Thomas turned to look at her, and his expression was serious. "I hope that is a good thing." "It is," Teresa said. "It is a very good thing." They sat in silence for a while, and Teresa became acutely aware of how close they were sitting, of the warmth of Thomas's body next to hers. She could smell the clean scent of him, soap and leather and something uniquely his own. Her heart was beating fast, and she knew she should move away, should maintain the careful distance she had worked so hard to keep between them. But she did not move. Instead, she found herself leaning slightly closer, drawn by a force she did not fully understand. Thomas seemed to feel it too. He turned toward her, and their eyes met and held. Teresa saw her own confusion and longing reflected in his honey-colored gaze, and she knew in that moment that he felt what she felt, wanted what she wanted. "Teresa," he said, his voice low and rough, "I need to tell you something. I need to be honest with you." "What is it?" Teresa asked, though part of her already knew, had known for weeks, but had been too afraid to acknowledge it. "I care about you," Thomas said simply. "More than I should, probably. More than is wise, given that you work for me and live in my house. But I cannot help it. Every day I watch you and I think about how strong you are, how brave, how you came here broken and put yourself back together, how you smile at the sunrise like it is the first one you have ever seen, how you hum when you think no one is listening, and I care about you so much." Teresa's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "Thomas, I do not know if I can do this. My marriage, it damaged me. I do not know if I can trust anyone again, if I can open my heart again. I am so afraid of being hurt." "I would never hurt you," Thomas said fiercely. "Never, Teresa. I would rather cut off my own arm than cause you pain." "You cannot promise that," Teresa said, a tear spilling over and running down her cheek. "No one can promise that. People hurt each other all the time, even when they do not mean to." "You are right," Thomas acknowledged. "I cannot promise that I will never hurt you, never disappoint you, never make mistakes. I am just a man, and men are far from perfect. But I can promise that I will always be honest with you, that I will respect you and your choices, that I will never try to control you or diminish you or make you less than you are. And I can promise that if I do hurt you, it will never be deliberately, and I will do everything in my power to make it right." Teresa looked into his eyes and saw only sincerity there, only truth. And she felt something inside her, that locked door that had been closed for so long, swing open just a little bit more. "I care about you too," she whispered. "I have been trying so hard not to, but I do. You are kind and good, and you make me feel safe in a way I have never felt before. But I am so scared, Thomas. I am terrified." "Then we will go slow," Thomas said. He reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough against hers, and the simple contact made Teresa's breath catch. "We will go as slow as you need. There is no rush, no pressure. We will just see where this goes if you want to." Did she want to? Teresa looked out at the canyon, at the ancient rocks and the endless sky, and thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The pain of her past, the loneliness, the grief. But also the journey that had led her here, to this place, to this man. The courage it had taken to leave, to start over, to try again. She was tired of being afraid. She was tired of letting the past control her present. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to risk her heart one more time. "I want to," Teresa said, and squeezed his hand. "I want to try." The smile that broke across Thomas's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture so old-fashioned and sweet that Teresa felt her heart turn over in her chest. They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, and everything looked different to Teresa now, touched with gold and full of possibility. When they reached the barn and Thomas helped her down from her horse, his hands lingered on her waist just a moment longer than necessary, and Teresa did not pull away. That night, lying in her bed with the window open to the cool desert air, Teresa thought about Thomas's words. He had said she came here broken and put herself back together. But she realized now that it was not quite true. She had not put herself back together alone. Thomas had helped, maybe without even realizing it. His patience, his kindness, his respect for her as a person rather than as property or decoration. He had helped her remember who she was beneath all the damage, had helped her discover who she could become. The next morning at breakfast, there was a new ease between them, a warmth that had not been there before. They smiled at each other over coffee, and when their hands brushed as they both reached for the sugar bowl, neither of them pulled away quickly. The days took on a new sweetness. Thomas still worked long hours on the ranch, and Teresa still had her household duties, but they found time for each other in small moments. A shared smile across the dinner table, a conversation on the porch in the evening. Rides together through the desert, exploring new trails and watching the hawks wheel overhead. Thomas courted her the old-fashioned way, with slow care and attention. He brought her wildflowers from the desert, their bright blooms a cheerful contrast to her black dresses. He told her stories about his childhood, about his dreams for the future. He listened when she talked about her hopes of teaching, and he encouraged her to write to the school in Nogales to inquire about opportunities. One evening in early October, about a month after their conversation at the canyon, Thomas asked Teresa if she would like to go into town with him the next day. "I have some business to take care of," he said, "and I thought maybe we could have dinner at the hotel restaurant afterward. If you would like." It would be their first public appearance together as anything other than employer and employee, and they both knew it. In a small town like Nogales, people would talk. They would make assumptions, but Teresa found she did not care as much as she would have expected. "I would like that very much," she said. "But Thomas, I do not have anything appropriate to wear. All I have are my mourning clothes." "Then we will buy you something new," Thomas said. "It has been over a year since your husband died, has it not? I think it would be perfectly acceptable for you to wear colors again, if you want to." Teresa thought about his words from that first day in the general store, about how she looked like she needed color in her life. He had been right then, and he was right now. The next day they drove into Nogales, and Thomas took her to the dry goods store. Teresa felt almost giddy as she looked through the bolts of fabric, touching calicos and ginghams in shades she had not worn since she was a girl. She finally settled on a dress in a soft blue that reminded her of the Arizona sky, with white trim at the collar and cuffs. "It will take a week to have it made up," the shopkeeper said. "Unless you need it sooner." Teresa looked at Thomas, who smiled at her. "A week is fine," he said. "We are in no hurry." They walked through town together, and Teresa was aware of the curious glances they received. She saw Mrs. Chen in front of the millinery shop and waved. The older woman's face broke into a wide smile, and she waved back enthusiastically, clearly delighted by this turn of events. They had dinner at the hotel restaurant, and it was the most romantic meal Teresa had ever experienced. Not because the food was fancy or the setting elegant, but because of the way Thomas looked at her across the table, like she was the only person in the world. They talked and laughed, and Teresa realized with a start that she was happy. Truly, genuinely happy in a way she had not been since she was a child. As they drove home under a sky full of stars, Thomas reached over and took her hand. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, their fingers intertwined, and Teresa felt like she was floating. The week, until her new dress was ready, seemed to crawl by. Teresa found herself counting the days, eager to see herself in something other than mourning clothes, eager to step fully into this new life she was building. When the dress was finally ready, Teresa put it on in her small room and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her was almost unrecognizable. Her face was tanned and healthy, her eyes bright. The blue dress brought out the color in her cheeks and made her dark hair shine. She looked alive, she realized. She looked like herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember. She walked out into the main room where Thomas was waiting, and the expression on his face when he saw her made her blush. "Teresa," he said softly, "you look beautiful." "It is just a dress," Teresa said, but she was smiling. "It is not the dress," Thomas said, crossing the room to stand in front of her. "It is you. You are beautiful inside and out, and I am the luckiest man in Arizona." He lifted his hand and gently touched her cheek, and Teresa leaned into the caress. They had not kissed yet, had not gone beyond holding hands and the occasional embrace, both of them taking things slow. But Teresa found herself wanting more, wanting to close the distance between them. "Thomas," she whispered, I think I am ready." "Ready for what?" Thomas asked, though his eyes said he knew exactly what she meant. "Ready to stop being so afraid," Teresa said. "Ready to trust this, to trust you. Ready to believe that maybe I can have something good in my life without it being taken away." Thomas cupped her face in both hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "You can, Teresa. I promise you we can have something good together, something real and lasting, if you will give me the chance." "I will," Teresa said. And then Thomas was kissing her, soft and sweet and careful, and Teresa felt like she was coming home. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, pouring into it all the longing and hope and fear and trust that she had been holding inside for so long. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you for weeks now, maybe from the first day I saw you in that store. I love your strength and your courage, and the way you have rebuilt yourself from the ashes of your old life. I love the way you sing to the horses and tend the garden and make this house a home. I love everything about you, Teresa Rodriguez." Teresa felt tears streaming down her face, but they were good tears, happy tears. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue. "I did not think I could love again, but you taught me. You showed me that love does not have to hurt, that it can heal instead. You taught me to ride, Thomas, but more than that, you taught me to hope. You taught me to live again." They held each other in the middle of the room as the sun set outside, painting the world in shades of gold and rose. And Teresa thought about everything that had led her to this moment, all the pain and struggle and heartbreak. She would not say she was grateful for those things exactly, but she could see now how they had shaped her, how they had made her strong enough to appreciate what she had found here. "Marry me," Thomas said suddenly, pulling back to look into her eyes. "I know it is fast, I know you might want to wait, but Teresa, I do not want to waste a single day. I want you to be my wife, not just my housekeeper. I want to build a life with you, a real life. Children if you want them. A future full of possibilities. Say yes." Teresa's heart was pounding, but not with fear this time. With excitement, with joy, with the dizzy feeling of standing on the edge of something wonderful. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, Thomas Vaughn, I will marry you." Thomas let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, he kissed her again, deeper this time, full of promise and passion. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony in the small church in Nogales. Mrs. Chen was there, beaming with pride. Miguel and his wife Rosa came, along with Jose and William and their families. Thomas's neighbors and fellow ranchers showed up, curious about the woman who had captured the heart of one of the most confirmed bachelors in the territory. Teresa wore her blue dress and carried a bouquet of desert wildflowers. Thomas wore his best suit and looked so handsome that Teresa's breath caught when she saw him waiting for her at the altar. They spoke their vows in clear, steady voices, and when the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance had to dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The reception was held at the ranch, and everyone contributed food and music. Teresa danced with Thomas under strings of lanterns hung between the trees, the stars bright overhead. She felt like she was floating, like she was living in a dream. Happy. Thomas murmured in her ear as they swayed to the music. Happier than I ever thought possible, Teresa replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. That night, after all the guests had gone home, Thomas carried Teresa over the threshold of their home. Not the home of employer and employee, but their shared home, the place where they would build their life together. They made love slowly, carefully, Thomas constantly checking to make sure Teresa was comfortable, that she felt safe. And Teresa discovered that physical intimacy did not have to be something to be endured, but could be beautiful and joyful and full of connection. She cried afterward, and Thomas held her, understanding without words that these were tears of healing, of letting go of old pain and embracing new joy. The first months of their marriage were blissful. They worked together on the ranch, partners in every sense of the word. Teresa took over more of the financial management, discovering she had a head for numbers and business. Thomas continued to teach her about ranching, and she continued to amaze him with how quickly she learned, how fearlessly she tackled new challenges. Winter came to the desert, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain that turned the scrubland green. Teresa wrote to the school in Nogales and was offered a position teaching the younger children 2 days a week. She accepted, and found that teaching brought her a satisfaction that was different from but equal to the satisfaction of her work on the ranch. In the spring, Teresa discovered she was pregnant. She told Thomas one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, and his face lit up with wonder and joy. "A baby," he said, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Teresa, you have made me the happiest man alive." "I hope you are not disappointed if it is a girl," Teresa said. She knew many men wanted sons to carry on the family name, to help with ranch work. Disappointed? Never. Boy or girl, this child will be loved and cherished and raised to know that they can be anything they want to be. Thomas kissed her softly, just like their mother. The pregnancy was not easy. Teresa suffered from terrible morning sickness in the first months, and the Arizona summer heat was oppressive as she grew larger. But Thomas was attentive and caring, taking on extra household duties and making sure Teresa rested. In late October of 1884, almost exactly 2 years after Teresa had first arrived in Nogales, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Gabriel Thomas Vaughn, and when Teresa held him for the first time, she marveled at the tiny, perfect miracle they had created. "He is beautiful," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion as he gazed down at his son, "just like his mother." "He has your eyes," Teresa observed, noting the golden-brown color of the baby's eyes as they briefly opened. "And your stubbornness, I bet," Thomas said with a laugh. "Heaven help us." Gabriel proved to be a good baby, healthy and strong. Teresa took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else, though she found it harder than she expected to balance the baby's needs with her teaching and ranch responsibilities. But Thomas was a devoted father, spending every moment he could with his son, singing to him and walking with him and marveling at every small development. When Gabriel was 6 months old, Teresa returned to teaching part-time, and Mrs. Chen's niece, a young woman named May, came to help with the baby and the housework. Teresa had worried about bringing someone else into their home, but May was quiet and efficient and treated Gabriel with such gentle care that Teresa's concerns quickly evaporated. The years that followed were full and rich. Gabriel grew into a bright, energetic toddler who loved horses almost as much as his father did. Teresa taught him his letters and numbers, and Thomas taught him to ride, starting him on a patient old pony when he was just 3 years old. When Gabriel was 4, Teresa gave birth to a daughter they named Lily Margaret Vaughn, after Teresa's beloved grandmother. Lily had Thomas's golden eyes and Teresa's dark hair, and she was as sweet-natured as her brother was wild. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Thomas expanded the herd and began raising horses as well as cattle, discovering a real talent for training. Teresa's teaching brought in additional income and gave her a sense of purpose beyond the ranch and family. They built an addition onto the house, adding more bedrooms and a proper office where Teresa could manage the ranch accounts and prepare her lessons. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Teresa with a trip to California, where they finally saw the ocean together. They left the children with Rosa and Miguel and traveled by train to San Diego, staying in a hotel right on the beach. Teresa stood at the edge of the vast Pacific and felt tears streaming down her face at the beauty and enormity of it. "Thank you," she said to Thomas, who stood beside her with his arm around her waist, "for bringing me here, for giving me all of this." "You gave me just as much," Thomas said. "More even. You gave me love and family and purpose. You turned a lonely ranch into a home. You taught me that I did not have to face the world alone." They made love that night to the sound of waves crashing against the shore, and Teresa thought about how far she had come from that frightened, broken woman who had arrived in Nogales 5 years earlier. That woman had been unable to feel, unable to hope. Now, Teresa's life was full of emotion, rich with love and joy and the occasional frustration and challenge that made the good moments even sweeter. When they returned home, Gabriel ran to meet them, chattering excitedly about everything he had done while they were gone. Lily toddled behind him, her face breaking into a wide smile when she saw her parents. Teresa scooped her up and held her close, breathing in the sweet scent of her daughter's hair, and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. "I am home," she whispered to Thomas, and he knew she did not just mean the ranch, but something deeper, something more fundamental. She was home in her heart, home in her soul, home in the life they had built together. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. There was the year of the drought, when they had to sell off part of the herd, and Thomas worked himself to exhaustion trying to keep the remaining cattle alive. Teresa stood by him through it all, managing their dwindling resources with careful attention, never complaining even when she had to scrimp and save on household expenses. There was the year when a fever swept through Nogales, and Teresa spent weeks nursing sick children at the school, terrified that Gabriel or Lily would fall ill. They remained healthy, thank God, but Teresa saw the fragility of life in a new way after watching 2 of her students die. There were good years too, years when the rains came at the right time and the cattle were fat and healthy. Years when Thomas's horses won prizes at the territorial fair. Years when Gabriel excelled in his studies, and Lily showed a talent for drawing that had both her parents marveling at her detailed sketches of desert wildlife. When Gabriel was 12, and Lily was 8, Teresa gave birth to another son, a surprise late baby they named Daniel. His arrival brought new energy to the household, and Gabriel and Lily doted on their little brother with fierce affection. Teresa was 40 then, and she would sometimes look at herself in the mirror and marvel at how different she looked from that young widow who had arrived in Nogales 16 years earlier. There were lines around her eyes now, and silver threads in her dark hair. Her hands were roughened from work, her skin tanned from years under the Arizona sun. But her eyes were bright and alive, and she carried herself with a confidence that would have been unimaginable in her first marriage. "You are even more beautiful now than the day I met you," Thomas told her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching their children play in the yard. He was 43 now, with silver at his temples and lines of laughter around his eyes. "You are a terrible liar," Teresa said with a laugh. "But I love you for it." "I am not lying," Thomas insisted. "You are beautiful because you are happy, because you are strong and confident and living the life you were meant to live. That kind of beauty does not fade with age, it only grows deeper." Teresa leaned her head on his shoulder, watching as Gabriel helped Lily into the saddle of her horse while little Daniel clapped his hands and demanded his turn. "You gave me this life, Thomas. You took a broken woman and helped her put herself back together." "No," Thomas said firmly. "You put yourself back together, Teresa. I just stood beside you while you did it, and fell more in love with you every day." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Teresa thought about that first riding lesson, when she had been so afraid of falling, so certain she would fail. She thought about how Thomas had patiently taught her, encouraged her, believed in her until she could believe in herself. He had taught her to ride, yes. But more than that, he had taught her to trust again, to hope again, to open her heart again. He had shown her that love did not have to hurt, that it could heal instead. And in doing so, he had given her back her life. When Gabriel turned 18, he announced his intention to expand the horse training operation, to make it the primary focus of the ranch rather than cattle. Thomas was hesitant at first, protective of the way things had always been done, but Teresa encouraged him to listen to their son's ideas. "He has a good head on his shoulders and he knows horses," she said. "And the market for good trained horses is growing. Let him try, Thomas. Trust him the way you trusted me all those years ago." Thomas did trust him, and Gabriel's instincts proved correct. Within a few years, the Vaughn Ranch was known throughout the territory for producing the finest trained horses in Arizona. Buyers came from as far away as California and Texas, and the ranch prospered as never before. Lily, at 16, announced that she wanted to go to San Francisco to study art. It was a bold dream for a ranch girl, but Teresa and Thomas had always encouraged their children to pursue their passions. They arranged for her to stay with Thomas's distant cousin and attend a school there, and though they missed her terribly, they were proud of her courage in chasing her dreams. Daniel, at 10, was still young enough to be content with life on the ranch, but Teresa could already see the restlessness in him that suggested he too would find his own path someday. She did not mind. She and Thomas had raised their children to be strong and independent, to know their own worth, to never settle for less than they deserved. If that meant they eventually left the ranch to build their own lives, so be it. One evening, when Teresa was 45 and Thomas was 48, they rode out to the canyon where Thomas had first told her he loved her. They had not been back in years, busy with the demands of ranch and family, but something had drawn them there this particular day. They stood at the edge of the canyon, holding hands and watching the play of light and shadow on the ancient rocks below. Teresa thought about all the years that had passed since that first visit, all the love and laughter and occasional tears that had filled those years. "Do you remember what I told you that day?" Thomas asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "You told me you loved me," Teresa said. "You told me I was strong and brave and that I had put myself back together." I told you that you came here broken, Thomas said. But I was wrong about that, Teresa. You were never broken. You were just bent, shaped by circumstances beyond your control. But you were never broken, because if you had been, you could not have become who you are now. You could not have built this life, raised these children, loved me the way you have. You were always strong. You just needed a chance to discover that strength. Teresa turned to face him, this man who had seen her at her lowest and loved her anyway, who had stood beside her as she rebuilt herself, who had given her space to become who she was meant to be. You taught me to love again, she said softly, echoing words she had spoken to him years ago but which still held the same truth. When I came to Nogales, I was so empty, so hollow. I did not think I would ever feel anything again, but you were patient with me. You taught me to ride, yes, but you also taught me to trust, to hope, to believe that I deserved good things. You taught me to love again, Thomas, and in doing so, you saved my life. Thomas pulled her close, and they stood together at the edge of the canyon, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful and lasting. I think we saved each other, Thomas murmured against her hair. I was lonely before you came, Teresa. I had my ranch and my work, but I had no real home, no real purpose beyond survival. You gave me all of that. You gave me love and family and a reason to get up in the morning beyond feeding cattle. We saved each other. They rode back to the ranch as the stars began to appear, and when they arrived, they found Gabriel waiting for them with news that his wife Anna was in labor with their first child. Thomas and Teresa rushed into town with him, and in the early hours of the morning, they became grandparents to a healthy baby girl named Rose. Holding her tiny granddaughter for the first time, Teresa marveled at the circle of life, at how far she had come from that terrified widow stepping off the stagecoach in Nogales all those years ago. She had been so certain then that her life was over, that she had nothing left to hope for. How wrong she had been. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, coming to stand beside her as she rocked the sleeping baby. "I am thinking about how grateful I am," Teresa said, "for all of it, the good and the bad, because it all led me here, to you, to this family, to this life. I would not change a single thing, Thomas, not one moment." "Neither would I," Thomas said, kissing her forehead gently. "Not one moment." The years continued to turn, as years do. More grandchildren arrived, and the ranch house rang with the laughter of children again. Gabriel took over more of the day-to-day running of the ranch, allowing Thomas to slow down a bit, though he never fully retired. He still rose before dawn and spent his days working with the horses he loved. Teresa continued teaching until she was 50, when she finally decided it was time to let younger teachers take over. But she never stopped learning, never stopped reading and growing. She and Thomas traveled when they could, seeing more of the West, always finding their way back home to the ranch that had been the foundation of their life together. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a huge celebration. There was music and dancing and food and laughter, and as Teresa looked around at the faces of the people she loved, she felt a sense of profound contentment. That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Teresa and Thomas sat on the porch as they had done countless times over the years. Thomas took her hand, his thumb rubbing gently over her knuckles in a gesture that had become as familiar and comforting as breathing. 30 years, he said wonderingly. "It seems like both forever and no time at all." "I know what you mean," Teresa said. "Sometimes I still feel like that frightened woman who did not know how to ride a horse, and then I look around at this life we have built, and I can barely remember being her." "She is still part of you," Thomas said. "All the versions of you are still there, Teresa. The frightened girl, the grieving widow, the woman learning to ride, the new bride, the mother, the grandmother. They are all woven together to make you who you are today. And who you are today is the woman I fall in love with over and over again, every single day. Teresa felt tears sting her eyes, happy tears that came more easily with age. You always know exactly what to say. I have had 30 years of practice, Thomas said with a smile. Then his expression grew more serious. Teresa, I want you to know something. If I could go back and live my life over, I would not change a single thing, because everything I did, every choice I made, every path I took, it all led me to you, and finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Oh, Thomas, Teresa said, her voice breaking. I feel exactly the same way. You gave me back my life. You taught me what real love looks like, feels like. You showed me that I was worth loving, that I deserved happiness. You taught me to ride, but more importantly, you taught me to love again, and I will never stop being grateful for that. They held each other as the stars wheeled overhead, the desert night cool and peaceful around them. And Teresa thought about that moment, so many years ago, when she had whispered those words to Thomas for the first time. You have taught me to love again. They had been true then, and they were still true now, perhaps even more so, because love was not something you learned once and then knew forever. It was something you practiced, day after day, year after year. It was choosing each other every morning, supporting each other through challenges, celebrating victories together, and building a life that was stronger and richer because you built it together. When they finally went inside, Thomas helped Teresa up from her chair with the gentle courtesy that had never faded over the years. They walked hand in hand to their bedroom, the same room they had shared for 30 years, and got ready for bed with the comfortable familiarity of long marriage. As they lay together in the darkness, Thomas pulled Teresa close, and she settled against him with a sigh of contentment. I love you, she whispered into the darkness. I love you too, Thomas whispered back. Always have, always will. And as Teresa drifted off to sleep, safe in her husband's arms, she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the cowboy who had taught her to ride, and in doing so, had taught her to love again. The following years were gentler, slower. Thomas and Teresa settled into a comfortable rhythm, no longer young but still very much in love. They took walks around the ranch together, visited their children and growing number of grandchildren, and spent their evenings on the porch, talking and remembering and dreaming about the future. When Teresa was 60, she began writing down her story, starting with that first day in Nogales when she had heard gunfire and pressed herself against an adobe wall. She wrote about her fear, her grief, her slow healing. She wrote about learning to ride, about falling in love, about building a life. She wrote it all down so that her grandchildren and great-grandchildren would know where they came from, would understand the courage and love that had been the foundation of their family. Thomas read the pages as she wrote them, and sometimes he would add his own memories, his own perspective. They laughed together over some parts and cried over others, but through it all, they marveled at the life they had shared. We have had a good life, haven't we? Thomas said one evening, reading over the latest pages. The best life, Teresa agreed. Better than I ever dreamed possible. When Thomas was 68 and Teresa was 65, Thomas suffered a mild heart attack. It terrified them both, a reminder of their mortality, but he recovered well with rest and care. The incident made them even more aware of the preciousness of time, and they made a point to tell each other, I love you, even more often than before, to never let a day pass without expressing their love and gratitude. On their 40th wedding anniversary, all their children and grandchildren gathered once again at the ranch. Gabriel was 41 now, with children of his own who were learning the family business. Lily had returned from San Francisco with her husband and 2 children, settling in Tucson where she taught art. Daniel was 31, working as a veterinarian in Phoenix, but visiting the ranch frequently. The celebration was joyful and full of laughter, and as Teresa looked around at the family she and Thomas had created, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. They had built something lasting, something good. Not just the ranch, though it continued to thrive, but a family built on love and respect, and the belief that everyone deserved to chase their dreams. That night, after everyone had finally settled down, Teresa and Thomas took one last walk around the ranch by moonlight. They walked slowly, hand in hand, past the barn where horses dozed in their stalls, past the corral where Teresa had taken her first riding lesson so many years ago, through the garden that was now tended by Gabriel's wife, but which Teresa had first coaxed back to life. "Do you remember that first day you brought me out here?" Teresa asked. "I was so scared, scared of the horse, scared of failing, scared of everything." "I remember," Thomas said, "but I also remember thinking that you were the bravest person I had ever met. Because you were terrified, but you tried anyway. That is real courage, Teresa, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. You gave me the courage to try," Teresa said. "You believed in me when I did not believe in myself." They stopped at the corral fence, and Teresa rested her head against Thomas's shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent. After 40 years of marriage, 65 years of life, she knew without doubt that this was where she was meant to be, with this man who had changed her life in every way that mattered. "You taught me to love again," she whispered, repeating the words that had become almost a refrain between them over the years. "Every day, Thomas, every single day you teach me what real love looks like. And you taught me that I did not have to be alone," Thomas replied. "That I was worthy of being loved. We taught each other, Teresa. We saved each other." They stood together in the moonlight, 2 people who had found each other when they needed it most and who had built a life of meaning and purpose and deep, abiding love. And as they turned to walk back to the house, still holding hands after all these years, Teresa knew that whatever time they had left, whether it was years or decades, they would face it together. Because that was what they did. They faced life together, with love and courage and unwavering commitment to each other. And that, Teresa thought as they climbed the steps to the porch, was the greatest gift anyone could receive. Not wealth or fame or even perfect health, but the gift of being truly, deeply loved by someone who saw you completely and loved you anyway. They lived many more good years together, years filled with the simple pleasures of long marriage. Morning coffee on the porch, evening walks, visits from children and grandchildren, quiet conversations, comfortable silences, the daily renewal of their commitment to each other. When Thomas was 75 and Teresa was 72, they celebrated their 47th wedding anniversary quietly, just the 2 of them. They rode out to the canyon one last time, moving slowly on older, gentler horses, and stood at the edge looking out over the vast expanse of rock and sky. "I want to come back here one more time," Thomas said. "The place where I first told you I loved you, where our life together really began." "It is perfect," Teresa said, squeezing his hand. "All of this, all of our life, it has been perfect. Not without challenges or sadness, but perfect because we faced it all together." "I could not have asked for a better partner," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have been my love, my best friend, my anchor. Everything good in my life came from loving you. And everything good in mine came from being loved by you," Teresa replied. "You took a broken widow and showed her how to live again. You taught me to ride, Thomas, but more than that, you taught me to love again. And that made all the difference." They stayed at the canyon until sunset, watching the light change on the ancient rocks, holding hands and remembering. Then they rode home through the purple twilight, still side by side after all these years, still partners in every way that mattered. Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, at the age of 77. Teresa held his hand as he drew his last breath, and though her grief was deep and real, she did not regret a single moment of their life together. He had given her 49 years of love, of partnership, of showing her every day that she was worthy of being cherished. At his funeral, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, Teresa stood and spoke about the man who had changed her life. "Thomas Vaughn was the kindest, most honorable man I ever knew," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her tears. "He took a frightened widow and taught her to ride a horse. But more than that, he taught her to hope again, to dream again, to love again. He showed me what real love looks like, how it supports and encourages and believes in you even when you don't believe in yourself. He gave me a life beyond anything I could have imagined, and I will be grateful for that gift every day until I join him again." Teresa lived for 5 more years after Thomas's death, years that were bittersweet but not empty. She was surrounded by family, by the legacy of love she and Thomas had created. She finished writing her story and gave copies to each of her children. She spent time with her great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their great-grandfather and the ranch he had built. And sometimes in the evening, she would sit on the porch alone and look out at the desert that had become her home. She would remember that first riding lesson, how terrified she had been, how certain she would fail. She would remember Thomas's patient voice, his steady hand on her ankle, his belief in her when she could not believe in herself. He had taught her to ride, yes. But more importantly, he had taught her that she was strong enough to do hard things, that she was worthy of being loved. That the past did not have to define the future. That even the most broken hearts could heal, given time and patience and the right person. On a warm spring evening in 1934, Teresa Rodriguez Vaughn passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 77, exactly 50 years after she had first arrived in Nogales as a frightened, broken widow. She was surrounded by family, loved and cherished to the end. At her funeral, Gabriel stood and spoke about his mother. "My mother taught us many things," he said. "She taught us to work hard, to be kind, to chase our dreams, but most of all she taught us about courage and love. She showed us that it is never too late to start over, never too late to heal, never too late to open your heart again. She and my father built something beautiful together, not just this ranch but a family, a legacy of love that will continue for generations. And I think if my mother were here, she would want you all to know this, that she came to Arizona broken and afraid, but she left this world whole and at peace. Because a cowboy taught her to ride, and in doing so, taught her to love again." They buried Teresa next to Thomas on a hill overlooking the ranch. Under the wide Arizona sky, they had both loved. And if you visit that spot even now, you can feel the love that still lingers there. The love between two people who found each other when they needed it most, and who built a life of meaning and beauty and deep, abiding joy. A love that began with riding lessons and grew into something eternal, something that still echoes in the laughter of their descendants and in the wind that blows across the desert they called home.